So we are now going to welcome Dr. Harouna KINDA, researcher at the Clermont Auvergne University, and he's going to talk about the impact of extractive industry governance on the issues around climate change.
Donc, bonjour tout le monde. Donc, j'aimerais d'abord remercier
Hello everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizing team for inviting us to this forum, which is of general interest, and thank you to all the participants. My presentation is about the governance of extractive industries in the face of climate change in Africa and what impacts to expect. My presentation will be based on those 7 main items, a much more analytical and operational presentation. And first of all, I will present the social and economical impacts of the extractive industry, the environmental impact, the energy transition, development, mining, taxation, the challenges of extractive industry governance, the role of governance in protecting the environment, and conclusions and remarks. First of all, we must say that the energy transition cannot happen without full and effective participation of Africa, which accounts for 30% of natural resources and critical minerals, be it gas, oil, and mineral resources. And we should also note that today, the extractive industry has a significant economical impact in 63 developing countries, including a majority of African countries. Those countries are struggling to mobilize the necessary resources to finance the development, and most of the population lives under the poverty threshold. More than 3.5 billion people live in resource-rich countries. If you include craft mines in Africa, 130 to 270 million people depend on artisanal mining. Here, I am presenting the evolution in terms of jobs for artisanal mining and industrial mining and the breakdown between the two. A large part of the population depends on artisanal mines in Africa, and this must be taken into account when we analyze the industry extractive industry. We often focus on industrial mines to assess their impact while disregarding artisanal mines that are less organized on the continent. And through this graph, we can see the contribution of mines, depending on the country, and the dependency in mining resources in all the African countries. The darkest countries are the ones that most depend on mining resources, mainly Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Africa, and Southern Africa. In terms of economical impact, we should take into account the contribution in terms of revenue from 2010 to 2020. This comes from an analysis of the African economy published by the AFD, the French Development Agency. And here you can see the countries that most depend on mining resources, including Chad and DRC, who spend half of their revenue coming from the extractive industry. Our analysis also focuses on the environmental impact of mining. This is one of the articles that I published analyzing the impact of mining resources on deforestation. I'm very much focused on deforestation because it is part of some of the major elements that contribute to greenhouse gases emissions. In this graph, you can see that if deforestation were a country, it would be the third contributors to greenhouse gases on the planet, right after China and the US. Deforestation and its impacts need to be analyzed in order to reduce greenhouse gases emissions. The extractive industry was analyzed for a very long time as part of a natural resource curse. But this natural resource curse is led to deforestation and greenhouse gases. There are analyses on infrastructure, channels, related to this industry that take much more space and contribute strongly to deforestation. We have made this analysis using this article, and we found that the extractive industry strongly contributes to the loss of forests coverage. We have analyzed 52 resource-rich countries, including 23 African countries over the period from 2001 to 2017. And we can see a positive link between mining rents and deforestation, and a link between oil rents, deforestation, and resources, so public expenditures and deforestation. I can come back to the explanations during the Q&A session to explain why there is a negative relationship between mining rents and a positive one with oil rents and public expenditures. This is a presentation of the main results. If you look at the second line, you can see that the impact of the extractive industry, that is oil, gas, and mining, well, it's a positive impact on deforestation, meaning that those industries strongly contribute to deforestation in developing countries. We can also analyze other factors, such as economic growth, population growth, population density, also rainfalls, development aid, and other countries who... And all these factors contribute to deforestation. This is a presentation of the minerals for energy transition here in Africa. You can see that Africa has a strong contribution to the energy transition, and the transition cannot happen without the contribution of Africa. Africa accounts for 43.9% of chrome volumes, and for cobalt, for DRC, it accounts for 68.4% of the total volume. These are very important minerals for the energy transition, and those minerals are in great part available in Africa. Let's now come back to taxation. Looking at the energy transition minerals and the trends of the extractive industry, developing countries are trying more and more to change their mining taxation code in order to get most benefits from those rents, in order to use this to develop sustainable development. And we can see that these countries here recently changed their mining codes. However, this did not have the expected impact. Regarding the changes in the mining code, there has been a change in the concession fees, the taxation system, and other types of taxes. But looking at the royalty systems, we can see that the rates are different depending on the country, but they have also changed over time, country by country, and depending on the type of minerals and their importance. The challenges in terms of governance for the extractive industry in Africa. There is a weak administration capacity in those countries, and they are unable to implement the right tax system, and there is no training to allow the leaders of the administration to adapt to those changes. There is also a strong tax competition between countries on the continent, which leads to a lack of significant tax system in order to get the most benefit. Certain countries tend to disregard the environment in order to get the benefits of investments in the mining industry. There is also a non-taxation of the artisanal sector, which is impossible to track, and it's also done in a very random way, which leads to further deforestation as well. The stabilization clauses of the mining codes leading to the fact that the changes in the mining code do not help the countries get the expected results due to those stabilization clauses that run over 10 to 30 years. So for the companies that were already in place, they are not impacted by the changes in the mining code. Those companies also find ways to have aggressive tax optimization to avoid those changes in the mining code. An IMF analysis shows that 15 African countries were losing between $450 and $730 million in tax revenue due to profit shifting by multinational companies, tax avoidance really. Second article aims at assessing the impact of governance on deforestation. This article is also available online, and through the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, we can see that throughout the value chain of the extractive industry, the environmental impact is taken into account in order to assess the environmental degradation as part of the development process for the mines, be it for contracts and licenses. We can see that the environmental aspects are taken into account through environment payments, and for production, there are also criteria, pre-production assessment of the environmental cost that could be due to the investment. In terms of revenue collection, there are also environmental revenues and often environmental related investments. When it comes to revenue allocation, in terms of industrial mines, there are certain differences depending on the level of quality. In addition, the institution asks for an assessment of the environmental and economical impact related to greenhouse gases and also water pollution of those mining investments in Africa and elsewhere. Here we have used the data of the 83 resource-rich countries over the period. That is the countries who are part of the initiative. By using the deforestation variable as a yearly loss. Here you can see that the countries who are not part of the system have a very high level of deforestation because this initiative is done in 3 different steps. The commitment to adhere, and then the efforts when the country becomes a candidate and when they're compliant. And we can see here that through the different steps of the implementation of the policy, the level of deforestation is reduced. This is the econometrical empirical model, and you can see that on the first line, the impact is negative. 352 hectares of reduction for the countries who adhere, minus 350. As a final conclusion, we can say that the improvement of institutions, we can see that the life possibilities help reduce the environmental aspect because we can see that it's in the countries who depend on the forest that the living standards increase through revenue to reduce environmental impacts.
So via a transparent tax system and environmental payment, this could contribute to reducing the environmental damage by between 300 to 700 hectares. And there should be eco taxes and polluters should pay. In Africa, this tax is not visible in administrations yet. It's a bit like the system in the EU. This would allow to reduce the environmental impacts. Most companies are multinational companies, and we also would like to promote corporate social responsibility in the extractive sector. Through this promotion, we could encourage companies to take into account the environmental aspect and to use new technologies allowing for more GHG reductions, and green spending would also allow for a reduction of the mining companies on the environment. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Kinda. So, first question, which is a bit technical. Someone asks, who wrote the mining code? The mining code is often drafted by experts, both national and international experts. And depending on the tax system in the country, the common law code is often different from the mining code because mining companies do not have the same economic metabolism as companies. So this mining code is often written by international experts and national experts summoned by government. There's also a question on carbon credit. I think you've mentioned it, you brushed upon it at the end. So it's a tax for companies that deteriorate the vegetal ecosystem. So will the governments implement this? So as I said, for the final taxes, if most companies that invest in the mining sector in Africa are multinational companies, so through the carbon tax system, The scheme could allow countries to make revenues and to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions through all the companies that adopt it or that pay taxes to have this. So this pollution credit is a good idea in Africa. According to you, is it a lack of political will that creates a challenge? Is it the lack of political will that creates challenges to implement an extractive governance, or are there other reasons? There are many reasons. There's the lack of political will of governments. And there's a lack of knowledge of the qualities in the human capital allowing to implement this policy. If we look at other companies, they manage to contribute to the well-being of populations. But we've also noticed in other countries that there's a lack of political will and knowledge in terms of extractive industries as well. So this means that there's not such a strong an impact on the level of the lack of willpower of governance. It's also human capital. And your point of view is that we should have experts in other places than where they are today, so train administrations. Implementing the mining code, so that's a discussion through in countries often we don't have experts that allow for these discussions. We should have a debate on this mining code between the company and government. So oftentimes companies have human capital, and maybe we need to, if we start cutting taxes, it benefits the company, but often at a government level, we don't have these types of experts that allow for these types of simulations, that allow for a more fairer level of revenue for governments. So how do you think we could solve that problem? To have experts in institutions, to try to see a little bit further what solutions to find it. There's an asymmetry of information between companies and governments, so companies know all of the factors linked to extraction, whereas oftentimes governments use it to start a discussion and negotiations of the mining code. Thank you.